On the morning of October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia walked into a midtown Manhattan barbershop and lowered himself into the chair with his back to the door. He was one of the most feared men in the history of American organized crime. He had ordered more killings than anyone could count, and he had cheated the executioner himself once, as a young man, when the state of New York had already sentenced him to death. For 30 years he had survived every war, every rival, and every case the courts tried to build against him. He would not survive the next 10 minutes, and the order to kill him had come from inside his own world. To understand what happened in that barbershop, you have to understand the year. By 1957, the American Mafia was no longer a loose collection of neighborhood gangs. It was a national organization with a governing body, the Commission, established by Charles Luciano in 1931 after the Castellamarese War tore the underworld apart. 5 families divided New York. Outfits in Chicago, Buffalo, New England, Detroit, and New Orleans held their own territory. The money came from the waterfront, from labor unions, from gambling, from narcotics. But 1957 was a year of open instability. That May, a gunman had shot Frank Costello in the lobby of his apartment building. Costello survived. The bullet only grazed his head, but he understood the message and stepped down as boss. The man later identified as the shooter was Vincent Gigante, who would be tried and acquitted, and the man widely believed to have ordered it was Vito Genovese. Genovese was not finished. With Costello gone, only one obstacle stood between him and control of the New York underworld. That obstacle was Albert Anastasia. Anastasia was born Umberto Anastasio in Tropea, in the Calabria region of southern Italy, in 1902. His father died when he was young, leaving a large family in hard poverty. As a teenager, he took work on a freighter, and around 1917, he slipped away from the ship at the Brooklyn docks and stayed. Several of his brothers followed. They found work as longshoremen, and Anastasia found the violence that ran the waterfront. His rise began, remarkably, on death row. On March 17, 1921, he was convicted of murdering a fellow longshoreman named George Torino after a dispute on the docks. He was sentenced to die in the electric chair and sent to Sing Sing prison in Ossining, New York, to await execution. He should have died there, but according to the documented record, his lawyers won him a retrial, and by the time that new trial was scheduled, 4 of the key prosecution witnesses had disappeared. Others changed their accounts. The state's case collapsed. In the spring of 1922, Albert Anastasia walked out of a death cell, a free man. It was around this time that he changed the spelling of his name from Anastasio to Anastasia. He had learned, at 20 years old, the single lesson that would define his entire career: witnesses who are not alive, and witnesses who are afraid, cannot convict you. That lesson became a pattern. In June of 1923, he was convicted of illegal possession of a firearm and served 2 years. But after that, the prosecutions simply stopped sticking. In 1932, he was indicted for a murder committed with an ice pick. The case was dropped when witnesses vanished. In 1933, he was charged with murder again. Again, no one would testify. Through the 1920s, he built real power on the Brooklyn waterfront, rising to control several locals of the International Longshoremen's Association, and, with allies like Joe Adonis and Vincent Mangano, bringing organization to waterfront racketeering. He attached himself first to Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria, and then, more importantly, to Charles Luciano. When Luciano moved to seize control of the New York underworld at the start of the 1930s, Anastasia was one of his most willing instruments. The documented record places him among the plotters against Masseria, who was killed at a Coney Island restaurant in 1931. By the account preserved in the organized crime histories, Anastasia's devotion to Luciano was total. He is quoted as having pledged to kill anyone Luciano needed dead to reach the top. When the long Castellamarese war between Masseria and his rival Salvatore Maranzano finally ended, and Maranzano too was murdered months later, Luciano stood at the head of a reorganized national syndicate, and Anastasia had helped put him there. As a reward for that loyalty, Luciano handed Anastasia a leadership role in the enforcement operation the press would later call Murder Incorporated, the group that carried out contract killings on behalf of the national syndicate. The exact number of murders tied to Anastasia through Murder Inc. will never be known. A syndicate informant later estimated dozens carried out on his orders. Broader estimates for the operation as a whole run into the hundreds. What the record makes clear is that for roughly a decade, Murder Inc. functioned as a professional killing service, and Anastasia was one of the men at its head. His reach extended to the very top of the syndicate's decision-making. In 1935, according to the documented account, the bootlegger Dutch Schultz demanded the commission's approval to murder Thomas Dewey, the crusading special prosecutor who was closing in on him. The commission refused. Killing a prosecutor of Dewey's stature would bring down a level of law enforcement retaliation the syndicate could not survive. When Schultz stormed out vowing to act alone, it was Anastasia who carried word to Luciano that Schultz had asked him to help scout Dewey's Manhattan apartment. The commission met, deliberated for hours, and ordered Schultz eliminated before he could move. On October 23, 1935, Dutch Schultz was shot in a Newark tavern and died the following day. That was Anastasia's world. Even the syndicate's own rules were enforced with a bullet. And for years he seemed untouchable, until 1941, when a Brooklyn gangster named Abe Reles was arrested and decided to talk. Reles had supplied the operation with killers for a decade, and his testimony sent several Murder Inc. members to the electric chair. More dangerous still, Reles had information that could finally implicate Anastasia directly in specific murders, including the 1939 killings of a union official named Morris Diamond and a dockworkers reform activist named Peter Panto. Panto's case is worth remembering because it is a reminder of who actually paid for the waterfront rackets. Peter Panto was a young Brooklyn longshoreman who had begun organizing dockworkers against the mob-controlled union locals that Anastasia's organization ran. He drew thousands of men to his meetings. He refused to be intimidated. In July of 1939, he vanished. His body was recovered long afterward, buried on a New Jersey farm. He was in his mid-20s. For years, dockworkers scrawled the phrase, "Dov'è Panto?" "Where is Panto?" across the Brooklyn waterfront, a question the mob never answered and the courts never resolved. According to the documented record, Anastasia offered a fortune for Reles's death, and on November 12, 1941, while under 24-hour police guard in a hotel on Coney Island, Abe Reles went out a sixth-floor window and fell to his death on the roof below. A grand jury a decade later officially ruled the fall accidental. A great many investigators never believed it. The one witness who could have put Albert Anastasia in the electric chair was gone, and the case against him died with him. By 1957 then, Anastasia had survived everything. He had beaten a death sentence, outlived his most dangerous informant, and taken a family of his own. In 1951, his boss, Vincent Mangano, vanished, and Mangano's brother Philip was found shot to death the same day. Many eyes turned to Anastasia. He was never charged. Instead, he simply assumed control of the family, the organization that, within a few years, the world would know as the Gambino family. He was the boss now. He had a 25-room mansion on a cliff in Fort Lee, New Jersey, overlooking the river and the city he had helped to run. But the very qualities that had carried him, the violence, the impatience, the appetite, were becoming a liability to the men around him. He had grown greedy. According to the documented record, Anastasia pushed to force his way into the lucrative casino operations in pre-revolution Cuba, ground already controlled by Meyer Lansky, and, in Tampa, by Santo Traficante. When Lansky refused him a larger share, Anastasia moved to build his own Cuban racket. That decision cost him the one man whose neutrality had kept him alive. Lansky, who had preferred to watch Anastasia and Genovese circle each other, now threw his weight behind Genovese. Joseph Bonanno, in his own memoir, credited himself with brokering a sit-down that briefly kept Anastasia from going to open war. But the decision had effectively already been made. Anastasia had made himself a problem for too many powerful men at once. Genovese, who wanted his seat, Gambino, his own underboss, who wanted the family, and Lansky, whose money he had threatened. A boss with that many enemies, and that little caution, does not last. There were also signs in his final years that the protection Anastasia had always enjoyed was thinning. In 1955, he pleaded guilty to federal income tax evasion and served a year in prison. The government then moved to strip his citizenship and deport him, and only narrowly failed when a higher court overturned the revocation. He was a boss under federal pressure, feuding with his peers, and expanding recklessly into ground other powerful men considered theirs. And the move against him, when it came, followed a clear sequence. First Costello. In May of 1957, A gunman stepped into Costello's apartment lobby, and though the shot only grazed his head, Costello read it correctly and stepped down. That removed Genovese's rival at the head of one family. Anastasia was the next and final piece. The machinery that Anastasia himself had spent his life helping to build, the quiet approval of the commission, the neutralized bodyguard, the anonymous gunmen, the wall of silence afterward, was now being turned, with precision, on him. On the morning of the 25th, his chauffeur and bodyguard, Anthony Coppola, drove him into the city and dropped him at the Park Sheraton Hotel at 870 7th Avenue. Coppola parked the car in an underground garage and then walked outside, leaving Anastasia, for the first time in a long time, entirely unprotected. Whether Coppola was part of the plot or simply absent at the worst possible moment has never been established on the record. Anastasia entered the ground-floor barbershop, run by a barber named Arthur Grasso, and settled into the chair. His barber that morning, Joseph Bocchino, draped him and began to work. Anastasia closed his eyes. At roughly 10:15, two men entered the shop. Contemporary press accounts and later historian accounts described them wearing hats, sunglasses, and scarves pulled up over their faces. They moved directly to the chair, waved the barber aside, and opened fire with revolvers. Accounts of the shooting vary in their details. As many as 10 shots were fired, roughly half of them struck him, and 2 of those wounds proved fatal, one to the head, and one that tore through his lung, kidney, and spleen. In the version of events documented by Selwyn Raab, and repeated in nearly every account since, the wounded Anastasia rose from the chair and lunged at his attackers. But, disoriented by the mirrored walls of the shop, he charged at their reflections rather than the men themselves. He collapsed dead on the barbershop floor, among his own hair cuttings and the white towels that became the enduring image of the crime. There were roughly 11 people in that shop. When the police questioned them, not one had seen anything they were willing to describe. The 10 minutes that followed the shooting were their own kind of chaos. The gunmen walked out the way they had come, through the hotel lobby and into the midtown crowd, and were gone before most of the people in the shop fully understood what had happened. Behind them, they left a scene that would be photographed and reprinted for decades. The toppled chair, the scattered white towels, the body on the tiled floor. Within minutes, the police radios carried the news, and reporters began converging on 7th Avenue. Among the first to arrive was Anastasia's own brother, Anthony, known on the Brooklyn docks as Tough Tony, a longshoremen's union leader in his own right, who reached the barbershop and broke down at the sight. The detectives who caught the case understood almost at once what they were dealing with, and how little they were likely ever to prove. They had a dead body, a room full of witnesses who had seen nothing, and no weapon, and no names. It was, in every respect, the kind of killing Anastasia himself had perfected. That was the terrible symmetry of it. The Lord High Executioner had been executed by his own method, and the silence that had always shielded him now shielded the men who had finally reached him. The investigation that followed was intense and, in the end, fruitless. The killing generated enormous public attention. A mob boss executed in daylight, in a midtown hotel, blocks from the theaters, in a city that thought it had seen everything. The New York Police Department pursued it hard, but the same code of silence that Anastasia had spent his life enforcing now protected his killers. No one was ever charged. No one was ever convicted. The crime remains officially unsolved to this day. What historians have reconstructed over the following decades is a remarkably consistent picture. Raab and other recognized chroniclers of the era document that the killing was ordered by Vito Genovese, with the cooperation of Anastasia's own underboss Carlo Gambino, and with the approval of Meyer Lansky and other syndicate leaders who had grown alarmed by Anastasia's conduct. Gambino stood to inherit the family, and he did. As for the men who pulled the triggers, the suspect named most often in the historical record is the young Brooklyn mobster, Joseph Gallo, and his crew. Gallo is documented as having boasted to an associate about the hit, in a line that survives in the record, calling himself and his men the Barbershop Quintet, but a boast is not evidence, and Gallo was never charged with the murder. To this day, no court has ever established who fired the shots. What is certain is what happened next, and the aftermath reshaped the American mafia more than any single killing of its era. Less than 3 weeks after the shooting, on November 14, 1957, roughly 60 organized crime figures from across the United States gathered at the country home of a mobster named Joseph Barbara in Appalachin, in upstate New York. The meeting is understood by historians to have been convened in large part to settle the new order that the Costello and Anastasia removals had created, to confirm Genovese's ascension and Gambino's control of the family Anastasia had left behind. Instead, it became a disaster. New York State Police under Sergeant Edgar Croswell, who had grown suspicious of the sudden traffic of expensive cars into the tiny town, raided the property. Dozens of the most powerful crime figures in the country were caught fleeing through the woods in their silk suits, or detained on the roads out of town. The Appalachian raid did what years of official denial had prevented. It forced federal law enforcement and a skeptical public to confront the fact that a coordinated national criminal organization actually existed. The pressure that followed never fully lifted again. Its effects compounded for years. The FBI, which had long minimized the existence of a national mafia, could no longer credibly do so, and expanded its organized crime work in the wake of the raid. In 1963, a Genovese family soldier named Joseph Valachi sat before a televised Senate committee and, for the first time, described the inner structure of Cosa Nostra to the American public: the families, the ranks, the initiation, and the commission itself. The line that runs from a barbershop floor in October 1957 through the woods at Appalachin 3 weeks later to a Senate hearing room in 1963 is one of the clearest chains of cause and effect in the documented history of American organized crime. The men who killed Anastasia had wanted to end an argument. Instead, they had handed the federal government a map of the entire organization. The men who had maneuvered to the top did not enjoy it for long. Genovese's reign, as the most powerful boss in New York, lasted barely a year. The documented record holds that Luciano, Costello, and Gambino, the very men Genovese had outmaneuvered, arranged his downfall in turn, reportedly bribing a narcotics defendant to testify against him. In 1958, Genovese was indicted on federal drug charges. In 1959, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison, where he would eventually die. Carlo Gambino, by contrast, took the quiet path. He ran the family that would carry his name for the better part of 2 decades, avoided the spotlight Anastasia had craved, and died of natural causes in his own home in 1976, one of the very few bosses of his generation to do so. The barbershop killing had been intended to settle the underworld once and for all. What it actually did was expose it, and set in motion the federal machinery that, over the following decades, would build toward the great RICO prosecutions of the 1980s. In trying to bury a national secret, the men who ordered Anastasia's death dragged it into the daylight. There is one more piece of the aftermath that outlasted every man involved. The reshuffle of 1957 is, in a real sense, why the New York families carry the names they carry today. When Genovese seized control of the family Luciano and Costello had led, it became the Genovese family. When Gambino took the family Anastasia had wrested from the Manganos, it became the Gambino family, 2 of the most powerful criminal organizations in the history of New York, out of the events that ran through that barbershop and the Appalachian woods. Whatever else the killers achieved or failed to achieve, they fixed the map of the 5 families for the next half-century, and the FBI, the federal prosecutors, and the historians would spend that half-century taking that map apart, name by name, in open court. Anastasia himself received no honors in death. The Diocese of Brooklyn refused to sanction a church funeral. He was buried at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, in a grave marked with the family's original spelling, Anastasio, attended by only a small number of relatives and friends. Within a year, his family left the country and changed the name again. The barber chairs in the Park Sheraton shop were repositioned to face away from the mirror. The chair he died in was eventually sold at auction, and today it sits in a museum. The shop itself is long gone. The ground floor of that building is now a coffee shop, and most of the people who pass through it have no idea what happened on that tiled floor. And the men who touched that morning are all long dead. Anastasia died in 1957. Genovese died in prison in 1969. Joseph Gallo, the man most often named as one of the shooters, was himself shot to death in a Manhattan restaurant in 1972. Frank Costello died in 1973. Carlo Gambino, the one who inherited everything, died in bed in 1976. Whatever score was being settled in that barbershop, the record shows that almost no one who touched it escaped the same violence for very long. This is how recognized historians document the case today. Selwyn Raab, in his History 5 Families, treats the Anastasia killing as a hinge point, the moment the balance of power in New York shifted decisively, and the modern federal era of organized crime enforcement truly began. Contemporary reporting from October 1957 preserves the physical facts of the scene, down to the towels and the mirror. The Appalachin raid is among the most thoroughly documented events in the entire history of American organized crime, recorded in the state police record and in the wave of federal scrutiny that followed. And it bears stating clearly, as it always must on this channel, that the men of organized crime represented a tiny criminal minority within the Italian-American community of their era. The broader community built American cities, served in 2 world wars, founded major industries, and had nothing to do with the conduct documented in this episode. The mafia was never Italian-American culture. It was a small, violent enterprise that preyed on that community as readily as it preyed on anyone else. In the end, the story of the barbershop is not really about one man's death. It is about an institution that governed itself through murder, and that turned the same machinery on its own leadership the moment that leadership became inconvenient. Albert Anastasia spent his life perfecting the unsolvable killing. He built a career on witnesses who disappeared and cases that fell apart. And in the end, he died the same way he had lived, shot down by men who were never identified, in a crime that was never solved, protected by the exact silence he had spent 30 years enforcing. The empire he had seized did not fall with him. It simply passed to a quieter man who had helped arrange his end. That is how power moved in that world. And that is why, in the end, no throne in it was ever safe. The men who killed him believed they were removing a danger. In truth, they were only demonstrating the rule that governed all of them, that in an organization built on murder, every leader is provisional, and every alliance lasts exactly as long as it stays useful. Anastasia had understood that rule better than almost anyone alive. He had simply forgotten, in his last years, that it applied to him too. Organized crime built its empire in the dark. Federal prosecutors and historians spent decades dragging it into the light. 5 Families Files exists to document what they found, not to glorify it, not to bury it, but to remember it. Wait for new episode. Sources for everything covered tonight are in the description. This has been 5 Families Files. Good night from the archive.